My name is Leah Paul-Gashvili, and I'm the president of the GMU Economics Society. On behalf of the Econ Society, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. The Econ Society is a student group, and we host events such as this one to help educate students about economics and other topics in economics. If you're interested in getting involved with us, please come see me after the event. I'd love to talk to you, and we'd love to get more students involved in the Econ Society. We're extremely fortunate to have Dr. Palmer speak to us tonight, and we'd like to thank the Future of Freedom Foundation for making this happen. Without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Jacob Hornberger. He's the founder and president of FFF.
Well, thank you. As our old-timers know here at the Economic Liberty Lecture Series, our program director at the Future of Freedom Foundation, Bart Frazier, is the guy that generally does the welcoming and the introduction of our speakers. And Bart, unfortunately, is laid up at home with a very, very bad case of the flu, the real flu. And so I'm sorry that happened, but I'm sure you're just as happy as I am that he insisted on not coming tonight. Which gives me an opportunity to do what I don't think I've done in the 3 years or so since we've been having this program, I think from the very first time, and that is to welcome you to this event, to thank you for your support of this event. This has been one of our most exciting programs, one of our more successful programs at the Future of Freedom Foundation. I assume by now that most of you know about FFF. Those of you that don't, we're a libertarian organization, an educational foundation. Our mission is to present an uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for the libertarian philosophy. We've been in existence about 21 years. And we have a daily email update that is by subscription. It's free. We would invite you to sign up for it. You can just go on our website at fff.org. We strive to make it the finest libertarian commentary page on the internet. You know, editorials, original articles, links to op-eds, and to give people a taste of what libertarianism is about, not just from the libertarian organizations, but from the mainstream media that are publishing libertarian perspectives. So I invite you to subscribe to that. That comes out 6 days a week. And we have a journal called Freedom Daily. We got free samples out there on the table. That's by subscription, $15 a year, I think, is the email version. And with getting on email update, you kind of keep up with what we're doing. I've got a regular internet show now, weekly, that I've been running for 4 or 5 months now on Saturday evenings. If you can't listen to it live, it's at 7 to 8 at night on Saturdays. We post it the following week in our email update. So it's nice to be here. It's nice to be partnering with the Economic Club here at George Mason. I mean, it's just, you know, when we first put this together, we really wanted to get together with you guys because you all are the hardcore, the nucleus of the future of this country with respect to libertarianism and Austrian economics. And that sort of is a nice segue into welcoming our speaker today, Tom Palmer, because I think we're all in for a real treat tonight. That there are few people that really that we can call just genuine scholars in terms, relatively speaking, you know, scholars in both Austrian economics and libertarianism. Tom is the vice president at the Atlas Economic Research Institute. He is also senior fellow at the Cato Institute, where he worked for many, many years before he went to Atlas. He's a director at the Cato University, has spoken at that event just countless times. He's the author of a book called Realizing Freedom, Libertarian Theory, History, and Practice. I mean, I think if there was, you know, if there's ever a model for the libertarian Austrian economic scholar, it's Tom Palmer. In fact, I think you're going to find tonight you will probably receive the most authentic Austrian talk that you've ever received, that you've ever watched or listened to. I don't know of anyone that has spoken to more audiences all over the world than Tom Palmer about libertarianism and Austrian economics. So please give a warm welcome to Tom Palmer.
So, vielen Dank, Bumper. Ich bedanke mich herzlich bei Bumper Hornberger und bei der George Mason Universität für diese Einladung, vor Ihnen eine Rede über Demokratie, Rechtsstaat und freie Marktwirtschaft halten zu können. Bumper, you said this was an Austrian audience.
That was an Austrian talk, too.
Yeah, well, okay. Well, since I know that Bumper doesn't speak German very well, I'll hold the talk in English instead. And the presentation that I want to address is this difficult question of the relationship between democracy, limited government, and the free market, and how they're connected. Now, quite often among advocates of the free market, you find a certain hostility, or at least cynicism, about democracy. H.L. Mencken said many memorable things, but two in particular about democracy. He said that democracy was the theory that the common man knows what he wants and deserves to get it good and hard. In addition, as he described elections, he said every election is but an advance auction on stolen goods. I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that, and indeed we see that in electioneering. The politicians, in effect, corrupt the population. It's not always the other way around. The image we're presented typically of corruption is wicked, horrible, bad people corrupt politicians by offering them money. But in fact, politicians corrupt the voters by buying their votes, offering to give them benefits paid for by somebody else. This has even gone so far in some cases that there are some people who have claimed that we should dispense with democracy, that other forms of government are inherently superior. Even a particularly kooky version of advocating monarchy on the grounds of property rights. The idea being that if the monarch owns the country, he or she, normally he, will act like a normal property owner and act so as to maximize the capital value of the resource rather than dissipate it through a variety of rent-seeking techniques. The problem, of course, that these people don't realize is there isn't really a market for buying and selling countries. Setting aside Liechtenstein, which was once won in a card game, most countries are not on the market. There's not a country market, and consequently no incentive for the alleged owner of a country to maximize the total value of the assets in the country. Instead, what we find is monarchs of various sorts loot the countries because they find that what is in the interest of the countrymen is not in their interest. And by looting the population, they can have more palaces and luxury goods. What I'd like to do is to stimulate some thought and discussion, maybe even some action, about certain structural features of democratic governance in general, and connect them to questions of constitutional and economic institutions and freedoms. So let's start with a couple of clarifications. Because democracy, like freedom and justice and some other terms, is one of those essentially contested concepts of which the philosopher W.B. Galley informed us in his seminal paper on the topic. He considered democracy to be the abrasive political concept par excellence. That is to say, the concept is wielded by different parties and schools, ideologies, but always with very, very different meanings. Alternatively, we could follow Ronald Dworkin's approach. His take on such debates, he distinguishes between the concept of democracy or justice or liberty and competing conceptions of democracy or justice or liberty. Everybody says they're for liberty or freedom. Very few people would say, freedom, I'm just against it. But they have very different conceptions of what freedom is about. It's national freedom or collective freedom or some other kind of freedom that is being disputed. Similarly, very few people openly oppose democracy these days, but they do argue quite vociferously over its meaning. I was in November in an interesting country. It's a Republic of Korea, but it's actually the People's Republic of Korea, not merely the public thing from which we get republic, but the People's Republic, and indeed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. in which the will of the nation is so thoroughly served that it is exemplified in the body of one man, Kim Jong-il, the great leader. And it is argued that this is a truly democratic state. So even that, the most totalitarian and possibly most oppressive state in the 20th century, just imagine if the Third Reich had lasted 65 years and it successfully cut itself off from the rest of the world, what would it look like? Even that regime claims to be democratic. Now, the term is used in such confusing ways in much contemporary discourse that the contending parties just talk past each other. There's not even a conversation. Let me give you two significant ways in which the term is used in contemporary American discourse. First, the idea that the majority of the population, and normally this is limited by age, they don't mean 4-year-olds, and by citizenship, make decisions about all those issues on which they choose to make decisions. That's democracy, majoritarianism. The second meaning, often in the same sentence, used in a very promiscuous way, refers to the substantive freedoms enjoyed by free and equal citizens, notably freedom of speech and assembly, and sometimes also including freedom of religion, freedom of exit, various procedural rights to due process of law, and so on. Now, it's worth noting that if we take either one of these in isolation, they are not obviously compatible. A majority might choose to say that the minority has to shut up, for example. That would be democratic. The majority says, we have decided what the truth is, we've decided how one should worship God, or what opinion one should hold. The rest of you, shut up. That's democracy. And indeed, many self-styled advocates of democracy today do insist that the majority can legitimately shut up the minority. The Chavez government of Venezuela has closed down opposition-oriented broadcasting stations, and they said, we do so in the name of democracy. The claim was that those broadcasting stations were organizing, quote, a gradual coup d'etat by allowing people to criticize the government on the air. Such criticism could eventually lead to a change in government. That would be what they called a gradual coup d'etat, and therefore, in the name of protecting the sovereignty of the Venezuelan state and the will of the people, that has to be stopped. We can think about Gaddafi and many other similar regimes. Chavez's good friend, Muammar Gaddafi, whom he's been defending recently on the radio. In fact, these systems are appropriately called, as George Orwell called them, oligarchical collectivism, is I think a better term for them. But they all insist that they are in fact democratic. On the other hand, if we were to insist on various inviolable rights, such as freedom of speech, religion, assembly, that entails limits on the power of majorities, as well as minorities, to exercise collective choice over those fields, over those issues. Now, to qualify as a democracy, both of these have to be incorporated. Some sense of there's a majority input, that the people are consulted and the majority prevails, but in addition, some system of protected rights, areas or topics that are not subject to collective choice. A formal system of individual rights with no institutional arrangements to protect them is just a fantasy. Some system to determine how the rights will be protected is needed. John Locke in the Second Treatise of Government gave us a number of very powerful arguments as to why majorities are a good means to determine such policies. It's very clear, as we would say in social choice theory, it's a Schelling point. If you say a minority, how small a minority does it have to be? And you'll generate incoherence in the system. Locke's argument is clear and concise. But a system of majoritarian democracy without free speech, for example, could not determine what majority opinion is and would merely lapse into some other form of oligarchical or personal dictatorship. Now, one way to integrate those two concepts into democratic thought is to focus on the concept of a sustainable democracy, namely a political system that does not degenerate inevitably into dictatorship. It requires that there be democratic or popular input in the governmental processes, and at the least that many officials of the government be replaceable by means of election. It also requires this protected sphere of individual rights, namely that the range of choices that are available to collective choice decision-making procedures be limited. That is, that those issues be off the table. And we call those issues that are off the table our rights. Those are the things that are not subject to collective choice. So sustainable democracies are those that are limited and that incorporate institutions that protect rights, both individual rights and rights of local autonomy as well, from being overridden by collective choice. That is to say, sustainable democracy is liberal democracy. Now, I believe that democracy without limited government is unsustainable. It's possible to have an illiberal democracy, to be sure, but it's not a sustainable project over time, as we've seen recently in Iran, in which they did have a system of popular election and people who were opposed to the ruling power could be elected. That has been completely dismantled. The logic of the system has now asserted itself, and it is a one-party dictatorship, and the opposition is all either in flight or in prison and in danger of execution. The dangers of democratic government, of rule by the demos, masses, have long been known. Democratic, or sometimes called popular government, that does not have a suitable constitutional framework that limits power and hems it in with a variety of checks and balances, inherently undermines itself. Students of Roman history should be aware of the dangers of Marian-style democratic movements, which tend to focus power on one man or one party as the carrier of the will of the people, which is what the Roman popular politician Gaius Marius considered himself. And again, we see this today if you consult the headlines, someone like Hugo Chavez and others who keep insisting they are the people. Unlimited democracies run the risk of one man, one vote, one time, which is one of the worst legacies of contemporary or modern democratic thinking. Benjamin Constant, the great classical liberal theorist of constitutionalism, in 1819 made a famous speech on the liberty of the ancients contrasted with that of the moderns. And I encourage you to read it at some point. It's a wonderful, a brilliant essay in political thought, many references to classical literature and French history and great philosophers. Once you have finished it, you might ponder the fact that it was actually an election speech to encourage people to go out and vote for the liberal candidate, something a little hard to imagine today where our level of political rhetoric has declined somewhat. But he contrasted what he called ancient liberty with modern liberty. He said that ancient liberty, quote, consisted in exercising collectively but directly several parts of the complete sovereignty, in deliberating in the public square over war and peace, in forming alliances with foreign governments, in voting laws and pronouncing judgments, in examining the accounts, the acts, the stewardships of the magistrates, and calling them to appear in front of the assembled people, in accusing, condemning, or absolving them. But if that is what the ancients called liberty, they admitted is compatible with this collective freedom, the complete subjugation of the individual to the authority of the community. You find among them almost none of the enjoyments which we have seen form part of the liberty of the moderns. The liberty of the moderns was what we would call individual liberty, or what classical liberals or libertarians would celebrate. Constant warned that the terror in France and later the rise of the Napoleonic dictatorship and the empire originated in a confusion about the nature of liberty of choice, whether it was an individual liberty that was involved or a collective liberty. In his famous study of the French Revolution, J.L. Tellman concluded that democracy is not an inherently liberal concept. And the book has a very provocative title, The Origins of Totalitarian Democracy. Fareed Zakaria, in his book, The Future of Freedom, Illiberal Democracy at Home and Abroad, focused recent discussion on the dangers of illiberal democracy. And again, Iran, was a very good example that he pointed to. But we have seen that its claim to be a democratic state has completely collapsed in just the last 2 years. One could have said 2 years ago that, well, it's not a free society, it's not a liberal society, they have a lot of terrible things there, but it would qualify as a democracy in some sense. That is no longer the case. There is no opposition allowed in the electoral system anymore in Iran. The dangers of unlimited democracy should be obvious to all who but consult history. A desirable democracy, that is to say, a democracy that is stable and that can persist, requires limited government and free market exchange. Let me spell out a couple of reasons why. First, a central element of a sustainable democratic political system is the existence of a loyal opposition. This concept is not very well understood, but it's absolutely central to understanding limited government and democracy. When one party replaces the other in control of parliament or Congress, the party or group formerly in charge of government shifts to become the loyal opposition. They don't flood into the streets, blow up train stations, or begin dynamiting buildings because they lost the election. But such loyalty is impossible, or at least very, very unlikely, if the losers, who now form the opposition, fear that by losing an election, they risk losing everything: their goods, their property, their rights, their freedom, even their lives. You cannot have a loyal opposition without limitations on the power of the party that won to punish those who lost. Without a loyal opposition, you cannot have a democracy. In the absence of limits on state power, no government can afford to relinquish power. That's one of the problems facing an authentically popular government today. Russia. I'm going to be flying tomorrow to Russia. And indeed, Putin and his assistant, Medvedev, who is the president of Russia, Putin is a very, very popular man. In free elections, he would clearly win. But he won't allow free elections because he's frightened that maybe he might lose. He knows that since he has been resurrecting, since coming into power, a police state, he can never afford to relinquish the levers of power, which means that he cannot afford ever to lose a free election, which means do not expect free elections in Russia anytime soon. Just as an aside, he knows who put him in power, Mr. Berezovsky, and he knows where he lives, in London, surrounded 24 hours a day by bodyguards. And Mr. Putin does not want that fate. Consequently, he cannot afford to lose an election. Second, even reliable elections require independent, authoritative bodies, not themselves subject to popular control, to determine the outcome of the elections. So that includes independent electoral commissions, and to supervise them, some kind of independent judiciary. That is to say, a judiciary not easily subject to punishment or removal by the elected branches of government. The literature on the necessity of the rule of law for sustainable economic development is very well developed, but those insights are no less applicable to the sustainability of democracy. Property rights and freedom of exchange rest on the same foundations, the same legal foundations as democratic governance. The late political economist Mansur Olson very neatly pointed out, I quote, "The conditions that are needed to have the individual rights needed for maximum economic development are exactly the same conditions that are needed to have a lasting democracy. Obviously, a democracy is not viable if individuals, including the leading rivals of the administration in power, lack the rights to free speech and to security for their property and contracts, or if the rule of law is not followed, even when it calls for the current administration to leave office." Thus, he concluded, the same court system, independent judiciary, and respect for law and individual rights that are needed for lasting democracy are also required for security of property and contract rights. It's long been argued by classical liberals that democratic governance rests on a foundation of free markets. Milton Friedman famously made that argument in Capitalism and Freedom, earlier, Friedrich Hayek in The Road to Serfdom and other essays, that a free society understood in terms of political freedom will not long be free if there is no economic freedom. And that's been given very, very strong empirical support by the studies done over the years in the Economic Freedom of the World report, which you can consult at freetheworld.com and download all the data and do whatever fun regressions you choose on them, that show an astonishingly persistent correlation over time between economic freedom on the one hand and political and civil liberties on the other. That leads us to the third reason, which is that democratic governments, like all governments, face a problem in decision-making. It's called the problem of time inconsistency. That is to say, having made a commitment at one point, they find it difficult to fulfill it later on, when, having already secured the advantage of having made the commitment, they no longer find it in their interests to live up to the commitment that they made. It's easy to promise at time A to do something at time B, but when time B comes around, having already gotten the benefit of having made the promise at time A, you may feel less inclined to fulfill the commitment. I promise to respect you in the morning is easy to say in the evening, in the throes of passion, but may be less easily carried out in the morning. Institutional economists such as Douglas North and Barry Weingast have argued that solutions to these problems were the key to long-term economic growth, by making it easier for people to make commitments that were advantageous to the rulers and to the ruled, and then to stick to those commitments. Limited government provides a vehicle for solving, or at least ameliorating, this problem of time inconsistency. Now let me address then quickly two issues that are deeply implicated in the nature of a sustainable liberal democracy resting on limited government, and then conclude with some thoughts on the roots of democracy in the reforms of 508 to 507 BC in ancient Athens. So the first question is, what does a limited government mean, or a limited state? Does it mean a weak government or a weak state? We sometimes hear libertarians speak like that. They want government to be weak, small, insignificant. I think that's actually a conceptual mistake. Limited government should not be confused with weak government. And again, our friend Benjamin Constant, a very deep thinker, meditated long on such matters, and he distinguished between weak authority and circumscribed or limited authority. In his book, The Principles of Politics Applicable to All Governments, he noted, quote, the circumscription, that is to say, enclosure of political authority within its precise limits, does not tend to weaken the necessary authority. On the contrary, it gives it the only real strength it can have. The jurisdiction of authority must be scrupulously limited. But once that jurisdiction is fixed, it must be so organized as always to be capable to attain swiftly and completely all the purposes within its remit. Freedom gains everything from the government's being severely confined within the bounds of its legitimacy, but it gains nothing from governments being feeble within those bounds. So the opposite of overbearing government is not weak government or no government. It's limited government. Not all weak governments are friendly to liberty or even to democracy. If they cannot protect life, liberty, and a state from violence, they are not protecting your freedom or sustainable democracy. And for those who might prefer anarchism or getting rid of the state altogether, I should remind them that not all anarchies are attractive. Southern Somalia is without an effective state, as was Lebanon during much of its recent history, and these are not particularly attractive places to live when there's civil war raging around you. The worst situation may be to live in powerful, unlimited states which crush individual freedom, local autonomy, democracy, and life itself. But weak, unlimited government, a situation in which the state knows no effective bounds to its activity, but within which it is unable to enforce the rules consistently or to provide a basic, reliable framework for social cooperation, is also unacceptable and illiberal. What's needed is not weak government, it's limited government. with the authority to provide a limited range of services, such as the protection of life, liberty, and legitimate legal claims of property, legal adjudication, and perhaps a limited range of other collective goods. So that leads me into the issue of collective goods, which might be more familiar to an economics audience. That is to say, a well-defined range of goods that will be subject to collective choice, authentically collective goods. The trend for much of recent history has been to define collective goods as those provided through some form of collective choice, which means choices imposed by some on others. Economists, in contrast, define collective goods or public goods rather narrowly, according to two polar characteristics. The first one is non-rivalrous consumption. If one person or group of persons consumes the good, it does not diminish the amount available for others to consume. Imagine a good, the consumption of which is rivalrous, an apple. Every time I take a bite, there's less apple for you to eat. In contrast, think of freedom of thought. If I have freedom of thought, or more freedom of thought, it doesn't follow that you have less as a consequence. I'm always amazed that every time I read a book, at the end, it's just as thick as it was at the beginning. You would think if you're consuming the knowledge that books would shrink and dwindle down as we consume them, but oddly enough, they do not. Now, there is a subclass of such goods which will be relevant in just a moment, and those are club goods. Goods such that the enjoyment by one person does not diminish the ability of others to enjoy it up to some limit, such as watching a movie in a theater, or imagine in this group, we can have more people sitting in the seats. One more person sits next to you. It doesn't diminish your ability to see the movie up to some limit if the room became very, very crowded. If I open my eyes to see the movie, it doesn't become dim for you. Every time I think of the Pythagorean theorem, you do not suddenly become befuddled and unable to understand it as a consequence. And yet, in the case of a club good, as more people crowd in, the ability to enjoy the show goes down. Now, the second characteristic after non-rivalrous consumption is that there are costs of exclusion. It's difficult, perhaps even at an extreme impossible, to exclude non-payers from the enjoyment of a good. If you enjoy the good of clean air, it's a little bit difficult to exclude others from enjoying that good. In many cases, though, we do spend scarce resources to exclude others from enjoying the good. Movie theaters, again, are a good example. There are walls around this movie theater. There's a little ticket booth outside. Resources are spent to print odd little pieces of paper that you have to present in order to come in to enjoy the movie, all of which is intended to exclude non-payers from enjoyment of the good. Now, advocates of sustainable democracy should reject the single-minded focus on popular sovereignty, namely the definition of a collective good is a good that the collective has chosen to provide, and instead focus on authentic collective goods and restrict collective choice only to those. A constitutional framework for sustainable liberal democracy must put certain questions and issues off the table. Decisions subject to collective choice should be limited to those that actually are collective goods. If we think about, for example, whether enjoying a certain kind of poetry is a collective good, we do subsidize through taxpayer money expenditures on, I'll put in quote marks, the arts, including astonishingly bad poetry that is subsidized by the National Endowment for the Arts. Is that actually a collective good? Well, not for me. I don't like that sort of thing. It is not a collective good. On the other hand, not being invaded by Canada, if you know Canadians, you understand what I'm talking about, is a collective good. If you've ever looked at the map of Canada along the US border, you will notice 90% of the Canadian population lives within 100 miles of the US border, a tiny band waiting for us to let our guard down, at which point they will flood over the borders and conquer us and subject us to Canadian culture. And avoiding that is an authentic collective good. I could not enjoy it and exclude you easily from its enjoyment. But the alternative approach to define as collective goods any good that has been made subject to a collective choice is a recipe for conflict. For when those on whom such choices are imposed see them not as collective goods, but as collective bads, they will rebel against them. Religion is a rather obvious example of that. Making religion subject to collective choice imposes on those who disagree with the majority what they see not merely as under or over provision of a collective good, but as a collective bad, having to worship God in a way that is contrary to their own conscience. And they are likely to respond to such imposed choices by resistance to the authority of the state, a process known in its extreme phases as civil war or genocide. Finally, I'd like to address the strength, if you will, of sustainable democracy. What social forces restrain power, thereby preventing the conversion of democratic governance into undemocratic tyranny? One cannot simply rely on the written provisions of a constitution, what James Madison referred to as parchment barriers, if they don't have behind them existing social forces to give them power. Such an obvious example that we saw for many years was the Soviet Constitution, which was full of guarantees of freedom of speech and assembly and so on. If you looked at it just on paper, you'd think, not a really bad place to live. But those are merely paper promises. There was no force to them whatsoever. Now, mere separation of powers, which many conservatives point to as the bulwark of freedom, really isn't enough, especially when those powers are artificially delineated or subject to periodic revision by the center. Take a simple example from American politics, the state or the People's Republic of California. The two houses of the legislature, the Assembly and the Senate, are both based on apportionment by population, meaning that the same population is represented in both houses on the basis of the same principle. Neither one can be an effective check on the other. In contrast, the U.S. Senate has limited the power of the House and the presidency precisely because it was intended to represent the states, the geographical areas of the separate states, which are unchanging political entities with distinct interests. Unfortunately, the popular election of the Senate, I think, got away from this notion, but it's still the case that the Senate is not a purely popular body. The people are represented according to a different principle. The other element of wisdom, which I greatly appreciate from Madison and others when they designed it, was precisely that only 1/3 is up for election at any given election year, which means 2/3 can ignore passing fads or enthusiasms or hysteria on the part of the population. This was brought home when one of our previous Bush presidents, George I, had proposed a bill for execution of what were called drug kingpins, which I think someone who was caught several times selling narcotics, and he wanted them to be executed. And indeed, the drug czar at the time, William Bennett, proposed that we have public beheadings of people if they were caught selling narcotics. He proposed that we have the army cordon off neighborhoods and go house to house to find people, and then we would execute them. And I remember the press conference where he stated this, and he was asked a question. I'll repeat the question, then I'll translate it for you. The question was, Secretary Bennett, aren't you concerned about some of the ethical implications and conditions of this statement, which we can translate into normal English? Are you out of your mind? And he responded that he had taught ethics at the University of Texas, so this wasn't a problem. The proposal to impose the death penalty for drug kingpins did pass the House. Very few politicians wanted to stand up and say, I'm with the drug kingpins, which is, of course, how they were portrayed by their opponents. But it failed in the Senate. And the reason was 2/3 of the senators did not have to face the voters in that election year. And that was a very wise thing, and I am very grateful to James Madison for having anticipated that and insulated the Constitution from popular hysteria of that sort. The French political scientist Bertrand de Juvenal concluded his book On Power with a very interesting thought that's worth pondering. Power cannot be limited by the mere dismemberment of the imperium into constituent parts, each with its distinct organ. We think executive branch and judicial branch and legislative branch. For a limitation of this kind to succeed, there must be in existence sectional interests in a sufficiently advanced state, conscious of their identity, and armed with strength to stop the encroachments of power on their own spheres, together with a system of law which is independent enough to arbitrate their clashes and escape from being the instrument of the central command. Now, I was reminded of that when I read a very interesting book, The Burden of Democracy by Pratap Banu Mehta, an Indian political scientist. And he was thinking about why it was that Indian democracy, with all of its unusual and interesting features, has been robust and persistent. He said, India has worked not because of unity and diversity, which is a slogan you hear in India, the presence of a locus of identity beneath differences, as the state is fond of telling us. We have flourished, rather, because we are diverse in our unities, each able to imagine the connection with others in his or her own way. As Mehta noted, one of the reasons for the relative success of India's democracy and its hanging together as a nation, I should point out, despite a really dazzling array of different languages that are spoken in the country, has been the profoundly cross-cutting character of cleavages within Indian society that has made collective action on a large scale to overthrow the state quite difficult to mount. I would add also that the federal nature of the Indian political system, much like the federal nature of the American political system, has been a great source of its durability, precisely because it establishes real sources of countervailing power backed up by sectional interest, which can provide the power necessary to overcome majoritarian overstepping of constitutional limits. We could look abroad to contemporary Hungary, where there's a discussion of a constitutional reform. To Americans, it sounds like a great idea when you talk to people who advocate this. Separation of powers, a strong presidency, legislature, judiciary. This is, in fact, in my opinion, a recipe for dictatorship by Viktor Orban, the prime minister who is designing a system such that he can become president. They have a two-thirds majority now in the parliament. This is a catastrophe for Hungary to have one party have such overwhelming power. And the consequence will be a presidential dictatorship of one sort or another. Americans who are accustomed to the American system don't realize that it does not export very well, and there's a simple reason for this. Countries that adopt a presidential system, in some sense modeled on America, almost always turn into dictatorship, in contrast to the Westminster model, namely where you have power in the parliament, which then elects a prime minister. And the reason is very simple. It's two words: George Washington. The Americans were very fortunate, very lucky to have had George Washington as their first president. And he resigned and said 2 terms are enough for any man, and set a precedent that lasted all the way up until FDR, who overstepped it. And then, after he was finally dead, the Constitution was amended to prevent that happening again and limiting it to 2 terms. Most countries are not lucky enough to have George Washington, and our American conception of the division of powers does not translate well to other political systems. Let me conclude then with some lessons from the first regime that was called democratic, Athens, following the reform of the Constitution in 508, 507, before the Common Era by the leader Cleisthenes, who orchestrated the overthrow of the tyranny of Hippias. The term that he evidently used was not democracy, but it's the term that Aristotle and others used to describe his accomplishments. The term he used was isonomia, or equality before the law. The voting system was deliberately recast in order to make it harder to create monolithic ruling blocs and to check the power of the leading clans, the family blocks, if you will. The clans were themselves reorganized to draw their sources from the various demes, as they were called, the local communities, which were in turn drawn from a city region, a coastal region, and an inland region in order to divide them up, to avoid the dominance of any one sectional interest in the management of the polity. But not only was power divided in this fashion in the Athenian constitution and put on a foundation of real interest, but a rule was established, the rule of isegoria, or equal freedom of speech. Deliberation on matters of collective choice required that people be allowed to speak frankly and that no one be punished for expressing his own opinion in a public debate. It's a very, very important principle. If there was to be collective deliberation, and I stand up and say, I disagree with this, and I lose, I can't be punished. They understood very well, if you do that, people will not speak frankly, and the deliberative process will be cut off at the root. So if we want to return to the roots of democracy in Athens, what we want is not merely unlimited rule by the demos or the multitude, but a complex system of checks and balances based on cross-cutting and sectional loyalties and a strong limit on the power of the majority to dictate to minorities in the form of freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. I should also point out, just as an aside, Benjamin Constant, in his meditation on the liberty of the ancients and the moderns, pointed out Athens was the most free in the modern sense of the ancient polities. And the reason was it was the most commercial. Property rights were best respected, and people engaged in commerce and had the independence from the state that was not available to them in, for example, Sparta, Athens' great rival. In conclusion, a sustainable liberal democracy requires that the power of the state be limited. Without limited powers, you cannot sustain a loyal opposition or reliable transfers of power that are peaceful. Without limited powers and rights to freedom of speech and assembly, you cannot even determine effectively in what way majority preferences may be changing. Without limited power, you cannot determine even who won the election. Without limited power, you cannot resolve the problem of time inconsistency. Without limited power, you run the risk of turning choice of collective goods into imposition of collective bads on large numbers of people, resulting in internal strife. Without existing sectional and various cross-cutting interests, like the United States Senate, that can effectively assert themselves, merely parchment barriers are ineffective at restraining tyranny or sustaining liberal democracy. Now, the roots of liberal democracy were understood fairly well 2,500 years ago by Cleisthenes and the Athenians who supported him. But why is it that so few people understand those principles today? That to be sustainable, a democratic politics must be limited. Thank you very much for your attention. I think we have opportunity for some discussion, so if anyone would like to pose a question.
Please wait for the mic and speak loudly because the mic is for the camera.
We have right back here.
Excuse me. Thanks for coming, Mr. Palmer. You mentioned the correlation between political rights and economic rights. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering which way you see the direction of that correlation, whether it's between the political rights pushing for economic freedom or economic freedom pushing the opposite way. So for instance, in China, economic freedom is advancing while political freedom is kind of uncertain. So whereas in other areas of the world, perhaps the Islamic world we're seeing right now, perhaps a rise in democracy, maybe not lead to a rise in economic freedom. So I was wondering about the what you see of the correlation there. If you could respond.
I'll do my best on that. The era of causality is an important issue to establish. In which direction does it go? So let's take one that we know quite well. Countries that embrace economic freedom become rich. We see rich countries have high degrees of economic freedom. We might ask, well, maybe rich countries adopt economic freedom. But we can consult the historical record, and there are a variety of statistical tests to show that is not the case. It's not the case that countries become rich and say, hey, let's have more economic freedom. Rather, for some various reasons, they adopt principles of free market economy and then become wealthy. But the relationship between political and civil liberties on the one hand and economic freedom on the other are much more complicated, and those seem to be bidirectional in terms of the causality. On the one hand, when people have the option to actually discuss things freely and talk about them, sometimes, it happens occasionally, rationality prevails, and people begin to adopt good policies. And we have seen cases in which you think about India under the license Raj, which was an economically very oppressive system, and still persists to some extent in India today, just a staggering array of permissions and restrictions and so on behavior. The country was desperately poor for a very long time. But democratic politics helped to bring about a public discussion, and a huge amount of those restrictions were swept away. India is now growing very, very rapidly, probably between 7 and 9% economic growth annually. As the Indians say, however, the Indian economy grows at night when the government is asleep. But that's a case in which democracy has led to more market-friendly policies, which has led to more economic growth and quite likely solidifying democracy. Take another country such as South Korea. South Korea did have a series of military rulers, autocratic regimes, but they got some policies basically right: security of property, freedom of contract, and the like. Became prosperous, developed a middle class, and then we see this other process stepping in. When countries reach a certain level of income, seems to be about $7,600 a year, as I recall from one of the studies, people begin to agitate for more right to determine the political course of the country. They're not willing to be dictated to anymore. So that's a very complex kind of causality. Let me mention, though, the question of China, which is an interesting case, and then the Arab world. We won't say Islamic world. This is Arab world we're talking about at the moment. I think that China is in some ways becoming more democratic and accountable, but in ways that are difficult for outsiders to perceive. Because we set the standard, which is it like our democratic accountability? And it's not. It falls far short of that. But the relevant baseline is where were they before, not where are we now. And the fact of the matter is that China today does have a more accountable system than they have had in the past. It is still a one-party dictatorship, and they make sure that people know that very clearly. But it is moving in the direction of much more accountable and rule-governed government than it was in the past. The other point I would make, before I turn to the revolts in the Arab world, is to be very cautious of people who cherry-pick data, and they look at someplace like Hong Kong and say, well, Hong Kong has a lot of economic freedom. They didn't have any political freedom, although they did have civil liberties, free press and so on. Under its administration as a British colony, they didn't have any political freedom. See, you don't need political freedom to have economic liberty. I think that's an outlying case. They just happen to have been really lucky that they got Sir John Cowperthwaite as their governor, and they were lucky. That's it. I'm not sure there's a big lesson to be drawn from that. We sometimes hear people say, well, small countries are more likely to adopt economic freedom, and Michael Walker at the Fraser Institute looked at the data. He said there was no significant correlation between size geographically or population-wise and economic policies. None whatsoever he could identify. But we think of little countries like that. We think, look how free they are. They stand out in our minds. When you look at the data as a whole, there's no correlation at all. And then finally, a case like Singapore. Singapore is an interesting case. They do rather well on the economic freedom front. It's not a totalitarian dictatorship. They hassle you if you chew gum. And if you criticize the government by saying, for example, that they use libel and slander laws to shut people up and bankrupt them, if they criticize the government, they will sue you for libel and slander and bankrupt you and shut you up, which is an interesting case. It proves the truth of the claim, but these people are immune to irony. So it's not a free society in the normal sense of the term. Singapore is not a free society in that way. It's also an outlier. It's a very odd statistical outlier. In a sense, we should view Singapore not so much as a country in the normal sense of the term, but as a really giant shopping mall owned by one family. They don't set the prices that the merchants charge in the individual stores, but it's not really a democratic country as such. It's essentially like living in someone else's shopping mall. And it doesn't work too badly from the perspective of collective goods. For such a small area, I don't think it would work over a larger geographical area, though. The principal agent problems would become too high. Lastly, about the Islamic world, we will see what happens, but we should not confuse people in the streets fighting against dictatorship with a movement for democracy. Let's see what happens there. It's not the same thing. And it's going to be touch and go in the future as to what systems will replace the autocratic regimes that are being partially removed. And I should emphasize partially. Only the New York Times would write the headline that I saw a while ago. The story was that the military had suspended the Constitution and dismissed the parliament. And the headline was, Egypt abandons authoritarian rule. Right? So just think about those, the story and the headline. We shall see where Egypt goes, but it's not obvious it's going to be liberal democracy. Let us hope. And my good Arab friends at minbaralhurriya.org are working very hard on these questions to promote liberty, but it's not by any means a sure thing. We had a question right here. Right in here? Where? There's someone right here.
You said that we should ask for a limited government rather than a weak government, but don't strong governments tend to outgrow their limits?
It's a question of what it is that we should focus on as the thing that we want to limit. And it's an important issue for people who are critics of expansive, oppressive, burdensome government to get clear on this. The size of the state is not the primary characteristic, in my opinion, that's objectionable. Should Fairfax have 7 more police officers or 7 fewer? I don't have a strong opinion on the question, but it is an interesting question. If you're on the city council of Fairfax or a voter of Fairfax, you want to have more cops or fewer cops? On the margin, are you going to get security that's worth the expenditure? That's an important question. But if we focus on the size of the state as such, how many police officers, what is their budget, we're missing the important question. What are they authorized to do? I'd rather live in a community that has 100 police officers who are only able to patrol the streets to make sure people are not robbed or mugged or raped or assaulted, than to have 60 police officers, a smaller government, if you will, that's authorized to arrest people for smoking pot, to break into their houses and determine if they have illegal substances, et cetera, et cetera. It's the scope of their powers that should be the primary focus for those people who favor liberty, and not the size of the state as such. A limited government is likely to be a small government, but that's a secondary feature of the primary thing we're concerned about, which is the limits on its power. That's clear enough. Now, the question then of when we say strong, we have to be careful. What does it mean to be strong or authoritative? And that, of course, is a loaded term because we think authoritarian when we hear authoritative. What I mean in this context is a government that can speak with authority, and it has the authority of the law, rather than just whatever someone's whim happened to have been. But that the legal system, the judge, has issued the appropriate order in accordance with due process of law, or the law of the land as it was put in Magna Carta. And to be able to have a regime that actually can enforce those laws that are universal rules and that are legitimate. In contrast, if you take, let's take an example, I'll go a little further afield, of taxation. In the Russian Federation, one of the few things that was done appropriately under the Putin government was the flat tax, in my opinion. 13% flat tax. Prior to that, they had an incredibly difficult, complicated system of taxes, more complicated even than here, which is hard to imagine. And no one paid taxes. Taxes were considered for stupid people. The consequence was a lawless tax regime. They would come in with masks on, smash down the doors, and cart everything off. That was how taxes were collected. When they implemented the flat tax, more people paid their taxes. Tax revenues actually rose. The reason was people said, okay, it's 13%, it's the same for me and for you, I'll pay it. I'm not, by the way, a big friend of taxes, but I'm going to come to some of the alternatives, why I think there are worse systems. Under that regime, it was now known, everyone's paying, tax collection went up, and the disruption of lawless, violent tax police declined dramatically. I don't want to make any point that it's perfect by any means, but this was a big improvement for business and for ordinary citizens to no longer be subject to being terrorized by the financial police, as they're called. Now, you might think, well, if we're for liberty, we should be against taxation. Good point. I think ultimately taxation is a form of theft. I used to think that wouldn't it be great if there was some way to finance the state that didn't rest on taxation, like having resources, oil, gold mines, something like that. Turns out that's a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare. A state that has a source of income independent of the taxpayers is almost certain to become a tyranny. That's what we've seen in the oil dictatorships, Libya, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, because the state now sees a source of revenue independent of any reciprocal dealings with the people. Why should we be accountable? Why should we be limited? Why should we respect what they call rights? We have money. This is, of course, what's happened in Russia. You can chart Russia's political history just by looking at crude oil prices. And you can tell what's going to happen in Russia. When crude oil prices collapse, there will be a political crisis again. And people will begin to talk about incentives. Right now, oil prices are still high enough, the regime can say, we have oil. What do we care about you? So, better to have a regime in which the rules are understood and people know that they will, in fact, be enforced. And I would rather live in such a law-governed regime than one in which it's not clear if the rule will be enforced, or it's known people can buy their way out of it. Last example. In many regimes in the world, when policemen stop you, they ask for money. Has that ever happened to you? I hope not, right? If it does, you'll be angry. You'll be really mad. You'll tell your friends about it. You'll do something. Most countries in the world, I shouldn't say most, but many countries in the world, if you're stopped by a policeman and they don't ask you for money, you think, I had a great day. I was stopped by the police and they did not ask for any money. That's cool. And I spent a lot of time in those countries where the police shake you down for money. I would rather live in a regime, and actually I had the experience, I was driving in Kyrgyzstan, and the driver we were talking about, he got pulled over and he paid some money to the policeman. And we drove off. And he said, you know, this corruption thing, it's not so bad. I just paid him and now I get to drive away. And I said, well, I'd rather live in a country where if the policeman stops you, you actually do have to pay the fine, not cash, but you get a ticket and you have to pay for it. He said, well, I like our system. And I said, well, think about it. How often do you get pulled over by the police? He says, all the time. I said, right, because every time they pull you over, they get a bribe. I know if I'm pulled over by the police in most countries that I drive in Western Europe or the United States, I was speeding, and I'll have to pay a fine. I don't want to have a situation where the policeman will say, hey, just give me like $20 and I'll let you go. Even though that sounds attractive at the moment, I'll avoid my $100 fine. I don't want that situation. And if a policeman said, I'll let you go if you give me 20 bucks, I would report him. Because I don't want to be subject to the arbitrary power that that kind of incentive will create for the police in future. So a strong government is one that is able to enforce the rules, including on the police, as opposed to a weak government, which makes us subject to all kinds of arbitrary violations of our rights. Anything else? Way back in the corner here, you have to hike. Maybe you could give it a big football pass.
I was curious how you'd characterize the relationship between America's interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan and the recent turmoil there, and how you would evaluate America's attempts at establishing rule of law in Afghanistan.
Okay. I was in Afghanistan just recently, and I work with very, very good people who promote libertarian values. They're very brave people, I should also point out. The policies of the U.S. government, NATO generally, and the European Union and all these other parties, I think are unlikely to succeed, setting aside the wisdom of the foreign policy intervention in the first place, which is very questionable. And the reason is that their model of success is crazy. They think that they can extend what they call the sovereign authority of the Karzai government, which is substantially a creation of our government, from one internationally recognized border of the country to another. That's what it means to be successful. In effect, their model is France. And everything is going to come from the center. It's kind of a French system of government. This will fail. And the first reason is this has never happened in the history of the country. Not Alexander the Great, not the Persians, not the Mughal Empire, not the Russian Empire, not the British Empire, not the Soviet Empire. It's not going to happen in my lifetime, despite having the yes we can administration. This will fail. And if you want to read a very good book on why, read James C. Scott's excellent book, The Art of Not Being Governed. People who live in mountain communities like that have developed political, economic, familial structures that are inherently resistant to being governed from the center. That's why they haven't been governed from the center for all those thousands of years. And these complex regions are not easy to govern, and just imposing it like this will fail. A much more modest approach might be successful if they recognized local autonomy. I was in Balkh province last year in the north, in Mazar-e-Sharif, and I met the governor of the province, and he said, you know, our government is set up in such a way, we collect a lot of the local tax revenue here and we send it all to Kabul, then they send back what they think we should spend. How does that work? Is that how it works in America? I said, well, unfortunately, kind of. But it's not the theory of federalism by any means, and we still have substantial federal autonomy. State governments manage their own affairs. They're not allowed to do that in Afghanistan. We set up this very centralized regime. Tax money goes to the center, and then some of it comes back. And they don't have any say over how it's dispersed locally. That's not going to generate a kind of democratic or law-based political system. So I don't think that this particular enterprise is going to be successful. I also think that the United States government should learn to keep its hands to itself and to shut up on occasion. It's a very difficult thing to do, but we just saw in Egypt our government supporting Mubarak, and then within a matter of weeks, claiming credit for having mobilized the street protests. This was shameful and disgusting, and they should just shut up and say, for the next 48 hours, we will be silent. The most difficult thing imaginable for them. What we should recognize is the following. There's a lesson to be learned here. You cannot export a democratic system and impose it by force. And when Condoleezza Rice said, well, we did it in Germany and Japan, those were two examples. Those were so different from Afghanistan and Iraq for many reasons. They had had previous constitutional regimes. There was a historical continuity with those regimes, not present in the case of Iraq or Afghanistan. And also, when those regimes had been defeated, they were militarily defeated. The state was razed to the ground and then rebuilt. This was not the case, effectively, in either Iraq or Afghanistan. But the deeper question is as follows. A system, a political modus operandi, a modus vivendi, in which people are willing to live together means we expect that the deals we make are likely to be respected. But so long as there's an 800-pound gorilla watching the conversation who can come in and overturn the table whenever it's not appealing to them, no deal can be expected to be likely to be enforceable. And everyone around the table in Iraq and Afghanistan knows if the U.S. government changes its mind, all deals are off. And consequently, there's very little incentive for people to make credible commitments, such that you could then develop a stable system of governance or something approximating the rule of law. So in a very deep sense, our continued presence in those countries undermines the very mission our government says it's there to promote, which is the establishment of some kind of rule of law and democratic governance. And the longer we persist there, in my opinion, the less likely that is to be the outcome. And we're more likely to promote an outcome of that sort if we make a credible commitment that the United States is going to withdraw from those countries and does so in a clear, unequivocal, and committed fashion. So I think that our policies are self-defeating.
We have time for one more.
Dr. Palmer, when political scholars talk about ways to improve the American system, often the structure of the debate is they look at past ways our system is set up and ways it has evolved to be different, and they say, oh, it was better in the past than it is right now. Putting all that aside, in all your travels around the world, are there features of government that you've seen that we have not tried in our history, but that you believe, if implemented in America, would make it a better system?
That's a hard question. I'm actually very skeptical of political utopianism when people say, I've got this one great idea, just do this one thing and everything is going to be great. Proportional representation, for example. This always keeps popping up in the American context. Why don't we have proportional representation? Every system can be gamed, including a proportional representation system, and has some unpleasant, unfortunate outcomes, namely tiny slivers of the electorate can, in effect, hold the rest of the electorate hostage, saying, we're the kingmakers, you have to satisfy us, even though we're only 7% of the electorate. So those sorts of changes in the rules, I'm just generally skeptical. For the United States, I think we're much better off with the Constitution. And as has been pointed out, the Constitution of the United States is not, by any means, a perfect document, but it is a lot better than what we have right now. And in effect, actually turning to the Constitution, I don't mean the unamended Constitution, I mean the Constitution as amended, is a pretty good system of governance. What's important is to get the political authorities to actually pay attention to it, to pay attention to the Ninth Amendment, to the 10th Amendment, to the doctrines of enumerated powers. For the United States, in my opinion, that's really the most likely path to success. And saying we should have this system from over here or that system from over here, it won't work. And I'll conclude with one thought about the distinction between, say, Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke on the question of liberty. I'm a big fan of the abstract formulation of individual rights. Every individual, regardless of history, color, creed, has the same equal rights. That is an abstract formulation of a liberal doctrine of rights, and I believe in it very strongly. It's also the case, as Edmund Burke understood, when rights are historically situated, they are more likely to be stable and persistent. So Burke, this puzzled me for many years. I didn't like Edmund Burke until I sat down and read him very, very carefully and began to understand the wisdom in his writings. He was a classical liberal of a sort, not a hoary conservative as he's often portrayed by any means. He was an opponent of absolute monarchy. But he understood that the American Revolution was formulated on the notion of the rights of Englishmen, our historic rights and liberties, which were then radicalized and set in motion a process that extended them more widely, male and female, black and white, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Scientologist, everybody, not just some limited category of persons. But the historical groundedness of those rights was very important. In contrast, his opposition to the French Revolution was partly because he said they were so enamored of abstract claims of reason without rootedness in historical experience, it was likely to lead to tyranny. And I think he was right, and that experience suggested that there was wisdom in supporting the American Revolution, but being more cautious about the ideological foundations of the French Revolution. And lastly, for all the economists, as this is the Economics Club, read Edmund Burke carefully on inflation, because most conservatives who read him don't understand him. He talks about how specie has retreated into the ground whence it came, and people wonder, what is he talking about? Species, birds, lizards? Specie means gold and silver. He was talking about paper money inflation, and that paper money inflation will destroy the foundations of the French society. It will tear it to pieces. He was exactly right, but it's quite opaque today. Most people who read it have no clue what he's talking about. He was, in fact, a rather good economist. And on that note, I thank you for your attention. Thank you, Bumper, for the invitation.
Thank you, Tom, for just a brilliant, fascinating, and insightful talk. You know, all of this is what we should be debating and discussing here as Americans. Especially, you know, one of the major points he made is, what is the role of government in a free society? That's what Americans need to be discussing in this presidential campaign and in the years ahead. That is the critical issue.